Okay, this lecture is over what I am calling remote access. These are the various protocols and commands that you might use to somehow access a machine that is remote from you over the internet. So the first one I want to talk about is Telnet. And Telnet has been around pretty much since the beginning of the internet, and it is considered to be the first application protocol on the internet. Uh, it was developed in the 60s when you had machines that were on a network and you wanted to remotely log into another machine. So it was developed in the late 60s when ARPANET, the predecessor to the internet, was created. And it was not formalized, however, until 1971 in RFC 97. So that's a pretty low number. We're in the thousands these days. An RFC stands for Request for Comment, and these are how standards were created on the internet. Basically, somebody would take the next number and say, this is RFC whatever, and I'm proposing this thing called Telnet. This is what it's all about. Here's the specifications of it. Here's some examples. What do people think? And then people would come back and say, hey, that sounds great, but I would change this one thing, or it might be nice if this other thing was added. And there would be a discussion period until it was formalized and the RFC was considered complete. So, like I said, the purpose of Telnet is to allow a user to log into a remote machine and have an interactive session with that machine. And again, this is done over the internet. As far as the port, Telnet uses port 23. However, I'll show you some examples. You can use other ports for doing different types of testing. So an example of how you would do this using the default port 23, which means I actually want to interactively log into the machine, is you issue the telnet command followed by a host name. So an example would be telnet district.bluegrass.kctcs.edu. Once you telnetted, it would give you a login prompt. You'd give your user ID. It'd ask you for your password. You would give your password. If your user ID and password were correct, then it would remotely log you in and give you a prompt to issue commands. So it's basically a CLI on a remote machine. I alluded to this a moment ago. There may be some reasons that you would want to use a port other than the default of port 23. One of them would be to test protocols. For example, you should know that port 80 is HTTP. So if you telnetted to some web server and said, I want to connect port 80, you would actually be talking to the web server and could, not in all cases, but some cases, interact with it, send commands, see what kind of prompts you get back. Another reason would be to test firewall rules. So if you should be able to get to a particular port on a particular machine that might have more than one or more firewalls in your path, you can telnet and see if you get a connection to that machine. If so, your firewall rules are probably correct. If not, your firewall rules might not be set up correctly. You can verify that a server is running and listening. So for example, if you had a database that was supposed to be running on port 3606, you could telnet to whatever machine it was running on, put space 3606. If it gives you a connection, then the server or the service is up and running. and ready to take connections. Now, something as complex as a database server, you're probably not going to be able to interact with it because the commands will be complex. They may be encoded, they may be binary in nature, but it would at least tell you that something was listening on that port and ready to accept connections. Now then, what is the disadvantage of Telnet? The big problem is everything, including your login ID and password, and all the data of the session travel over the network in clear text. That means if you sniff the packets with something like Wireshark, you're going to be able to get a lot of information out of the packets that maybe you don't want people to know. At UK, we have not allowed Telnet. I don't even know for how long, at least 20 plus years, because it is insecure. So, Telnet is very insecure. We still need to interactively log into other machines. So the solution is Secure Shell, which is often just called SSH. This was developed in 1995, and the purpose, which I alluded to, was to allow a user to remotely and interactively log into another machine via the internet, which is, exactly what I said about Telnet. But the big but is this is encrypted. So if somebody tries to sniff your secure shell session, your user ID, your password, and all the data transferred is going to be encrypted and just look like garbage to somebody that's trying to snoop through your packets. As far as the port, SSH uses port 22. And one example would be, let's see, sorry about that. An example would be me logging into the student web server at UK. I would type SSH space my user ID, which is Wayne, at the machine name, which is sweb.uky.edu. And then I would have an interactive session. To me, it would just look exactly the same as a Telnet session, but to somebody sniffing the network traffic, they're not going to be able to see that. We have something called the Berkeley R commands. I think I told you in a previous lecture that the University of California, Berkeley developed and created a lot of the software and commands on Unix machines. These R commands that they're called were developed in 1982, and the purpose of the R commands is to allow a user on one Unix computer to easily log into or issue commands on another Unix machine. The port that these R commands use is port 513. And one thing that makes all this possible is the concept of something called equivalent host. Equivalent hosts are a collection of machine names. All these machines are considered to be run by the same system administrator or administrators. They have the same user IDs on all the machines. Something called a UID, which is a Unix identifier, is going to be consistent for the users across the machines. So the way you declare something to be an equivalent host is the system administrator would create a file called /etc/host.equiv that is going to have a list of all these hosts in it. Users can add their own, and it will work very similar by doing that in their ~rhost file. Tilde is the Unix symbol that basically means my home directory / a file called .rhost. So I can put that in there as well and allow myself to log in between machines. If you're on equivalent host, you can access or log into those machines without using a password. So that's the big plus. It just kind of automatically happens. If you've already authenticated on your local machine, the remote machine is considered an equivalent host, so it's just going to let you access it. This is not a totally inclusive list. There's a couple of commands that might be a little bit hard to explain that I left out of this, but the first one is rlogin. So rlogin is kind of like Telnet or SSH in that it gives you a connection to a remote machine and gives you an interactive shell, again, without having to provide any authentication. RShell allows you to execute commands on a remote computer. So I can say RSH, some host name, and then the command that I would like to issue on that remote computer. There's rcopy that will allow you to copy a file or set of files from one computer to another. There's a command called rwho, so if you have a cluster of machines that are considered equivalent, you can issue the rwho command and it will show you all the users logged into all those machines and give their user ID and which of those machines they're logged into. There's a stat command for getting kernel statistics. rstat will get you kernel statistics from a remote computer. And then the last one I'm going to talk about is ruptime. And basically there is a command on Unix machines called uptime that will tell you how long the machine has been up or down. And it will give you something called a load average, which is something that kind of tells you how busy a machine is or what kind of load that machine has. So ruptime will list out all the hosts and give you that. I think also it usually tells you how many users are logged into each machine. So a very handy command, especially if you are an administrator of a collection of Unix machines. The next remote file access we want to talk about is FTP, which stands for File Transfer Protocol. So basically this allows you to upload and download files between computers. This was developed in 1971. Back in the 70s, this is the way, instead of going to the web to get files, you had to use the FTP command to go to a bunch of FTP servers that had the information you wanted and then download that information. So not as nice as the web is today. So as I just said, the purpose is to upload and download files from a remote computer via the internet. I think we've mentioned this before, but FTP actually uses two ports. Port 20 is used for the actual upload or download data transfer. Port 21 is used for what they call the control channel, which you can think of as issuing commands. FTP has the same problem that Telnet has, which is all this data and the login to the FTP server, if it's required, goes across the internet in clear text. So I don't know how long it's been, but I would say at least 10 years probably that we have not allowed straight FTP or original FTP at the University of Kentucky. It does have a replacement though, because this is something that is still needed, and that replacement is Secure FTP. Secure FTP was developed in the late 90s over the course of 1997 and 1998. The purpose is to provide FTP services, but in a secure fashion, i.e. it's going to use SSL, which is Secure Socket Layer, to do that. SFTP port, since this is using SSL, it is going to be over port 22, which you should recall is the same port that SSH uses. An example FTP session might look like this. Basically, I have the Unix prop at the top on my laptop. I issue SFTP space user ID at machine. I actually did this on my local computer because that was just the easiest thing to do instead of VPN into campus or something and doing this. It asked me for my password. I typed my password. I typed my password correctly, so it tells me I'm connected to localhost and gives me an SFTP prompt. I CD'd down into my sites directory, and then I issued an ls command, which is the Unix way to list the files in the current directory. And I got these 9 files, and then I was done, so I typed quit, and it exited my SFTP client and gave me my prompt back. So that's just kind of what an FTP or SFTP session is going to look like. There's another variation of FTP called TFTP or Trivial FTP. This was developed in 1980, however it was not standardized until 1981. And that standardization is in the request for comment number 1350. And the purpose of Trivial FTP is to provide FTP services, but in a simple, stripped down fashion. There still is some error checking in there by, I'm going to send you packet 10. It tells you back, I got packet 10. Okay, I'm going to send 11. Okay, I got 11 back. So it's a really simple handshake to make sure that the packets do arrive and that they arrive in order. As far as the port, it uses multiple ports. The main port for the transfer request is always port 69. However, when the transfer is taking place, there is a random port that is agreed upon during the transfer initialization when you are uploading or downloading or transferring data. So 69 is the well-known port. It also uses a random port, would be another way to say that. So what is Trivial FTP used? I don't know that it was ever really heavily used for transfers over the internet like FTP, but virtually it is never used for internet transfers. We might use it to transfer boot software that downloads to, let's say, a diskless client. We might use it, like we use this in Cisco classes, for loading or backing up device configurations. So that finishes the discussion of some concepts related to remote access.